I'm Reverend Normandy Ellis, and I'll be interviewing Reverend Win Srogi. Today is April the 14th, 2017, and we are at the library at Camp Chesterfield. So thank you, Reverend Win, for doing this interview with us.
You're more than welcome.
Yes, so the first thing I wanted to ask you was to tell us about how you were called to camp, including what year that was.
It would have been the late 70s, and my wife and I had always heard about camp, but we had never visited here. At that time, we were living in Toledo, Ohio, and met Suzanne Greer, and she convinced us to come down one weekend to put on a psychic fair to raise money for camp, because they didn't have enough money to pay their light bill. So we did, and as we got to around Fort Wayne, the snow started to come down. By the time we got to Chesterfield, there was close to 2 feet of snow on the ground. In fact, my first memories when we first got here, I took a walk down. I had always heard about the Trail of Religions. Took a walk down to the Trail of Religions, and by the time I got to the Trail of Religion, the snow was literally up to my belt buckle. It had piled up. And I saw that with all the snow and basically fell in love with it, and just the energy here made both myself and my wife feel that this was a special place, and that's the way it started, and it went on from there. And we had a very successful weekend, snow and all. We raised almost $2,000 and paid the camp's light bill.
That's great. How long did it take you to come back?
From that point on, we were down here approximately once a month. The following year, Reverend Louise Irving was president at that time, and my wife had taken a summer seminar. I was busy at work and could not, but Louise decided that she was going to have a fall seminar in October. And I attended that seminar with my wife, Shirley. And I think there was a total of 10 students and 14 teachers. There were definitely more teachers than students. And everybody other than Louise kept saying, we're not going to have another October seminary. But from that point on, which would have been probably 79 or 80, they had a seminar every October, as well as the spring and summer seminars.
And what made it grow from there?
I think as the word spread, people started to come to that time of year because it was a beautiful time of year. Many years the trees were starting to change colors. And in fact, as Shirley and I went for papers, that became our favorite seminar. And every test and every paper we earned here through ordination was done at the October seminar.
So tell me a little bit about Suzanne Greer and meeting her. She seems to have been really influential in your coming here.
Yes, she was. She's the reason we did come here. I worked at that time for Dana Corporation and had just moved to the Toledo area to Dana corporate headquarters. And we stopped at a local bookstore because both Shirley and I were into the metaphysics. In fact, Shirley was my teacher in astrology. That's how I met her at a metaphysical retreat up in Michigan, what's called Camp It's a beautiful outdoor setting, actually a setting where they teach special high IQ kids during the year. And it's called Camp It's in the Irish Hills, which are just a magical area. Well, that's where I first met Shirley. She was my teacher in astrology. I was self-taught until I met her. And I often joke that I married the teacher in order to pass the class. But she was a very, very, very good astrologer. In fact, she was personal astrologer for Henry Ford II. Got to have dinner with him one night, him and his girlfriend, and had to be sworn to secrecy because he still wasn't divorced at the time. But she was probably more interested in Chesterfield than I was, and as we stopped in this bookstore, we asked, is there anybody in town that has classes or meetings that's involved in the metaphysical areas? And the gal that ran the bookstore gave us Suzanne Greer's name and phone number. So we called Susie and found out she was having weekly development classes at her home in Toledo. And we started going to them. And she was always talking about camp. We did a couple psychic fairs up in Toledo to help raise money. And then that led to about 10 of us, there were 2 carloads, driving to Chesterfield to put on the psychic fair to raise money. Suzanne was really my teacher in spiritualism. And then once I was here, I studied with numerous teachers. The 2 that I remember most of all was Louise Irving and Mamie Brown, one that people don't say too much about anymore.
Tell me about Mamie Brown, and then tell me about Louise.
Mamie was getting up in age when I first met her, and she would hold her classes in her seance room, which was in the basement of her house. Well, she wasn't real stable getting down the stairs, so she would literally go down the stairs on her butt. But she was a very, very good medium, and probably the thing I remember most of her, well, 2 things. Number 1, every year we would hold what we called a watermelon festival in honor of Mamie Brown. And we'd always have music and lots of watermelon. And one year I got to dance with her in the Maxon cafeteria, as it was called at that time. And I can remember watching her serve church as she got older. Her 2 grandsons would be with her, and by that time she had got so unstable that she was either in a wheelchair or used a walker, or her grandsons helped her. Well, they would help her get up. She would sit in the front row of the church. And they would help her get up on the platform, and Spirit would come in, and she'd shake her arms and say, "Go sit down, boys." And while Spirit was in, she'd move around that platform like nobody's business. One of the best stand-up clairvoyants I've ever watched work. And then you'd hear her say, "Okay, this is my last one." And the two boys would get up and they'd get poised, and she would finish her last message and literally fall into their arms. When Spirit left, she collapsed. But when Spirit was with her, she worked as if she was 30 years younger and just moved all over that platform. We also, both Shirley and I, sat with Louise for trance. Now, Shirley developed trance and became a very good trance medium. But I always had to laugh, because her guide, Bettina, when she first started to do trance, was very reluctant to come out. And Louise kept coaxing and coaxing. Took a couple of sessions, but finally Bettina came out, said to Louise, "You know, Louise, how some people don't do windows? Well, I don't do messages, so there." Poor Louise laughed so hard she fell on the floor. But that was the beginning, and after that, Bettina became her door opener, and Susie did, or Shirley did, an awful lot of trance work. In fact, at one time, Shirley and Suzanne Greer did double trance in the chapel. Well, no, I was in the cathedral at that time. And she had a guide that had capability of, she being Shirley, had a guide that had capability of reading the Akashic records. So the way we would do that is I would work with her and explain to the people in church what the Akashic records were, and that the records of their past lives that directly affected the current life were available in the Hall of Records. And they all had a 4x6 note card, and we asked them to write a single question down and sign their name, so that, and then pass them forward. Well, Shirley would go into trance, and we would turn the lights down. So all of this was happening in the light. We used a red light once. Shirley decided she really didn't like that, so we just turned the lights way down. So basically she was doing trance in the light. And we would collect the cards, and I would go through them and pick, and we generally do 15 or 20 of the cards, and I would ask the question, and her guide, Dr. Chang, would come through and answer the questions and explain why people were in the situations they were in and what lessons they were supposed to be learning, up to a point. He would not give them enough information so that they knew which decision to make. He explained to them, I cannot violate your free will. This is the type of situation you're going to get yourself into, but you have to make the choices of what to do. So he would never tell them what to do, he'd just explain the situations. And it was amazing how many people would come back 6 months, a year, 2 years later and say, you know, that exact situation's happened to me and this was my choice.
Yeah. Wow. Well, those are some good stories. Can you tell me any information about when you received your ordination papers or what that process was like?
Well, the process was very similar to what it is now. Excuse me. In that you went through and had specific classes to take, which are pretty much the same as they are today. And then you had to take a written test. And demonstrate the fact that you could do clairvoyance or whatever. Now, for Shirley and I, we had that ability when we arrived here because we'd been working at it for years. In fact, our first seminary where the both of us were together was that October seminar. And both Shirley and I worked as an usher, as a message giver, as a sermon giver, and as a chairperson in that first seminar. We worked all four of those. We then passed that test, went on for our associates and started traveling to different churches to do our sermon and message work in various churches. And since we had to do both sermon and message work, we would go to a church and either Shirley would work and I'd hang around, or I would work and she'd hang around, so that we were doing both sermon and message.
Right.
There was a couple churches that had both of us do messages, but only one person got credit because you had to do both message and sermon.
Right.
And we got our associate's papers. In fact, one of our good friends was ordained the year, well, at the same seminar in October, that we got our associate's papers. And I'll tell you a cute story about that in a minute. I forget his last name, but we all called him Joe. His wife still lives in Indianapolis. But then we went on, and 2 years later we got our ordination. We were one of the few people that went straight through and did from start to finish in 4 years.
Mm-hmm. What year was the ordination?
1980, I think it was the year I moved here full time, which would have been 1984. Mm-hmm. We actually bought our house here in 1980, but we had a camper that we parked over by the west restroom and lived in that while I basically gutted and rebuilt the house so that it was presentable. And by that time I was running my own business, so I used to laugh that we had one bedroom and one office at that time. That was before I put the addition on. But Joe Horvath was his name. He had moved here from California and basically got introduced to this place about the same way we did. Just gone through a bad breakup. And after about 2 years, we became very good friends, and we would ask each other questions for the different tests. And he decided that it was time for him to meet a woman again. He was tired of being alone. So Shirley and I helped him with what we call a want list, in which you define all the characteristics you want this person to have. And it's one of the things I've always said, be careful what you ask for, because you're going to get it. He met his wife to a spit and image. She was exactly what he asked for. The one thing he forgot to put down on the paper was that she be single. Now, luckily, as it turned out, she was in the process of getting a divorce, but she was not single when they met. So I've told that story in numerous classes, you know, be careful what you ask for, because you're going to get it. But she had 2 kids, which he ended up continuing to raise. And it used to be in the library, but one of the kids took a picture, and you could see on the picture, it's like somebody took a light wand and scribbled on it. Well, we couldn't figure out what it said until somebody held it up in the mirror. It was the mirror image of the word love, spelled out on a picture that her son took of them as they were coming out of the chapel, because that's where they were married.
Nice. That's nice. So tell me a little bit about, was the metaphysical program part of your regular studies, or was it separate at that time?
No, most of the classes with even some of the Alice Bailey material were taught in the regular seminar, but they were taught as electives, as opposed to anything you could get credit for. It was during the last year of Louise's last term as president that she indicated that we should offer something for the metaphysics and develop that as an actual program. And Louise, Shirley, and I started to outline something that would have basically the same requirements as going for ordination. In other words, there would be 3 levels and the same number of credits as going through the mediumship would be the level 1, going through associate would be the level 2, and going through ordination would be the level 3, so that we had something very similar to that, where those that were going for ordination had to go out and serve other churches. We set it up so that they had to work in doing some sort of a public ceremony or public demonstration here, or if they could find a church that wanted it done someplace else, they could go someplace else and do it. But they had to, at the first time, they had to be like the assistant to someone that was a metaphysician. And then as they continued on, they became the leader, and the metaphysician became the assistant. And we pushed them to get groups involved, so there were, many of the ceremonies contained 3, 4, 5 people that worked with that. Now at that time, Louise was very much into the metaphysical side, although she never took part in any of the ceremonies other than communion. Myself, Shirley, Mary Beth Attaway, we were the three staff that were very much involved in it. And then that's about the time that Shirley took ill. So she did a lot of the work, but really wasn't able to participate in the ceremonies. Her rheumatoid arthritis just wouldn't allow her to stand and do the ceremonial work. But she still taught at the house and was very much a part of the early program until the day she died.
So how long has that program been going now?
I don't remember the exact date that we started it, but it's been going for over 10 years. I'd say 10, 12 years now.
Okay, okay. So are there other memorable times or events or things that happened at camp that you could tell us about?
Well, the one that really got my heart racing was the night that the Lily Hotel burned down. I woke up feeling something was wrong and looked out my upstairs window and saw flames shooting above the two big pine trees. They were about 40 feet tall, and called the fire department and came over as fast as I could and basically watched the hotel burn to the ground. Now, part of the hotel in the back, we salvaged some furniture and other things out of it, and we salvaged some bricks, actually sold bricks for a while to help raise money. But it was beyond repair. Working with the insurance company, they basically paid us to tear it down and fill it in. Actually, the back of the hotel came all the way back to what is now the parking lot for the bookstore. And it's a shame because it was in better shape, and we had just bought lumber to do some repair work on the hotel. That lumber was stored in the lobby of the hotel. It was a case of arson. There were, during that period of time, a half a dozen churches around the state of Indiana that were also burned. And they did catch the arsonist. Turned out that he had actually worked as a dishwasher in our cafeteria one summer.
Oh, wow.
And he got sentenced to 20 years in prison because he was convicted not only of the Lily fire, but I think 3 out of the 6 church fires. The police suspected him of the other 3, but didn't have enough evidence to convict him.
Right.
But he got 20-year sentence out of it.
And so the sister hotels stood together until what year?
See, I was president of camp at that time, so that would be late 80s, early 90s, somewhere in that.
Okay.
I'd have to really get into
Yeah.
one of the history books to give you an exact date, but
Right.
It was interesting. People stayed in both of the hotels, and depending on who it was that was visiting, their favorite hotel was either the Lily, the Sunflower, or the Western. Now the Western we would have open in the early spring and in the late fall, and if we had anything going on in the winter time, the Western would be open, because there was heat in the Western.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Lily and the Sunflower by that time, although they had furnaces originally to heat them, the furnaces were dead by that time. And so we only opened them during the summer. Mm-hmm. They stayed cooler in the summertime than the Western did, because the Western, once you got those bricks hot from the sunshine, it stayed hot.
Right.
Where the Western would cool down nice, or the Sunflower and Lily would cool down nice, and you could get some cross ventilation through the different rooms, and especially the Sunflower, people used to love to stay in there because all of the people from bygone years, their spirit energy would run up and down the hall, and people had really neat experiences in there.
Do you remember some of those?
I never stayed in there. I always stayed in the Western. And I can remember a few experiences in the Western. I can remember people telling me about experiences in the Sunflower and the Lily. One of the funny things that happened, we used to get milk delivery every day, and it was when we were first down here. And I was somewhat of an early riser. And the milkman was one that was, he didn't like coming on these grounds anyway. He was sort of scared to come here. And we had a woman that used to come out in the morning and do a little bit of her exercises out in the middle of the grounds in her long flowing nightgown and robe. Well, he saw her sort of humming to herself and whirling around, thought it was a ghost, dropped the milk bottles, got in the truck, and went roaring out the front gate. And I happened to see it, and that was the first year I was on the board. I was a trustee. I replaced Phyllis Harrison, who was another one of the metaphysical teachers. She taught astrology and handwriting analysis, but got a hold of a couple people so we could get an alternate milkman to bring us milk for the cafeteria.
That's pretty good. Huh.
Yeah, that was about as funny as the time that people dumped 2 gallons of dish soap in the fountain and we had bubbles all over the center of the ground.
I bet that was a mess to clean up.
Oh, yeah, we never did find out who did it.
So, what was camp like? You said when you first came in October, there were not very many people here, and yet there were 2 hotels in the Western. So when were those hotels full, and what were the grounds like?
The only time that, well, when the Sunflower was still operational, the Western would fill up. People many times wanted to stay in the Western, but got bumped into the Sunflower. We never got to a point during my being here. You'd have to go back into the 60s when there was no room left at the inn. I didn't get here till late 70s, and by that time it was summer only that the Western would be totally full, and the Sunflower and Lily would be maybe a quarter full. And then after the Lily burned down, the Sunflower would get maybe half full during the convention period and summer seminar. During the seminars, the Western was full almost 100% of the time. Like coming into spring seminar this year, we've got a waiting list for people.
Right.
And that's been pretty much the way it's been for every seminar since we had to close the Sunflower down.
Right. Right. How do you think spiritualism is interpreted or read these days? What brings people here? What keeps them here?
The primary thing for many people is to be able to talk to a loved one who's now in spirit. And I think the greatest thing about spiritualism is it removes the fear of death, because it shows that there is a continuity of consciousness as a medium brings through that loved one or friend or whoever it might be, and touches in enough with that so that there is recognition of who that person is. And a good example of that, one of the other old-time mediums, Virginia Falls. I finally got my mother to come down here. Now, my mother was very intuitive, but her mother was Church of God, and this was the work of the devil. And so it scared my mother. I did get her to come down to the cathedral. Virginia Falls and her guide, Bluebell, were working. Virginia was in trance. Brought my mother's longtime boyfriend in. Described him to a T, and quoted verbatim the last words he ever said to my mother.
Wow.
And it's those kind of things, and I've seen that happen more than once. I've done it a couple times. Similar situation. That prove to the people that life continues. Yes, we have a change called death, but it's like Wayne Dyer says in his books, we're spiritual beings that have chosen a physical experience. We're not physical beings seeking a spiritual experience.
Right.
Our true self is that spiritual being. And it even says so in the Bible. All these things that I do, you can do also, is a quote from Jesus. Well, if we can do all those things, and if we were created in the image of God, I don't think he's talking about the physical appearance. I think he's talking about the ability, and this is what metaphysics is all about, learning how to tap into that spark of God that is within us.